Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 87, The Baltic Crusades, Part 3. We last visited the Baltic with the Knights having successfully suppressed an uprising in Prussia. But in 1260 the Prussians rebelled again, led by Hercus Monte, a Natangian. Hercus had been captured by the Knights in his youth, sent to Magdeburg for education, and had then spent years fighting with the Knights, so he had inside knowledge of their strengths and weaknesses, and he used it. The uprising began in the east, across Samland, Natangia, Bartia, and Warmia. The Prussians killed German missionaries, merchants, settlers, and local collaborators. The Order's garrisons were lured into the open and suffered heavy losses in guerrilla fighting. As the situation became critical, the Pope called for a new crusade. An army was gathered in the Rhineland and marched on Königsberg, where it defeated a Sambian army besieging the city. However, when the Crusaders left, the Sambians returned. Königsberg held, but many other castles fell. At Kreuzberg, the entire garrison was slaughtered. In 1262, the Sudovians invaded Mazovia, and the Lithuanians attacked western Prussia and eastern Poland. The Lithuanians took territory in Mazovia, Pogesania, and reached Kulm. In 1263, Hercus Monte led the Natangians in a raid into Kulmerland. The master of Prussia was in Kulm, and quickly gathered a force to chase them. The Knights caught up to the Natangians, who were encumbered by their prisoners, near Lobau, now Lubawa, in Poland. The Knights' first charge smashed into the Natangian formation, but Monte had taught them how to deal with heavy cavalry. He personally led a group that cut off and killed the master and the marshal. The leaderless Knights fell into disarray and were slaughtered. It seemed like a turning point, but the rebels were unable to unite to capitalize on their victory. The surviving garrisons continued to hold out. Königsberg held off the Sambians and even managed to extend its fortifications. By 1265, new Crusader armies had been gathered and were arriving to reinforce them. In 1267, King Ottokar of Bohemia was promised the lands of Sudovia and Galindia, which had not yet been conquered, in return for bringing a new Crusader army to Prussia. He marched against Mestvin, the son of Duke Svitopolk of Pomerania, who had declared war on the Order. Mestvin was forced to agree to peace, but the spring thaws were already rendering travel difficult, and further campaigning had to be suspended. By the 1270s, the Order was returning to the offensive. From its strongholds on the Baltic coast and its castles on the Vistula and Pregel, it launched raids deep into territory held by the Balts. The main fighting was in Pogesania. The Barians, Sudovians, and Lithuanians all invaded, trying to break the Order's grip on the region, but were unable to overcome its fortresses and garrisons. In 1272, the Crusaders assembled a campaign against Hercus Monte in Natangia, devastating the region. Monte was reduced to hiding in the forests with a small band of men. Finally, he was captured and executed. The last of the Prussian resistance was driven back into the forests and wetlands of Pogocernia. By 1274, the order had finally cornered the Prussian resistance at Heilsberg, now Wittbach-Worbinski in Poland, where the Prussian army was crushed. In 1277, the Prussians tried to rebel again, and a punitive army ravaged Pogocernia, rounding up peasants for resettlement or driving them off into Samogitia. Over the next few years, the campaign continued through Nadruvia and Sudovia, crushing all resistance. By 1283, the region was a depopulated wilderness. The people had either been forcibly moved to work the Order's land in the west, or fled to Lithuania. Sudovia became the new frontier between the Order, Lithuania, and Poland. Further to the east, we heard previously how the Samogitians and Semigalians had inflicted a heavy defeat on the Sword Brothers at Saule back in 1236, killing the master and most of its knights. This had led to the Teutonic Order taking over the Sword Brothers and their castles, and sending knights and support staff into Livonia. Livonia was racked by conflict between the crusading orders and the local bishops, who tried to deal directly with the Pope to establish their authority over the knights, all while campaigning against the Lithuanians, Estonians, and Novgorod. The Pope's legate, William of Modena, had tried to resolve the conflicts by reallocating the conquered territories between the Teutonic Order and the bishoprics of Riga, Dorpat, and Orselvik, and a new bishopric in Courland. Not long after it took over the Sword Brothers, the Order agreed to give northern Estonia to the King of Denmark in exchange for Danish military support. King Valdemar granted the Order Järvia, now Järve, in Estonia, which was outside the jurisdiction of any of the bishops, and they agreed that they would share any new conquests. This led to the campaigns defeated by Alexander Nevsky, which resulted in the establishment of a border between the Catholic and Orthodox worlds. The Livonian Knights then switched their focus from the east to the south. First, they had to consolidate control over the territory that they already held. This involved extensive investment in castle building, starting with the fortresses the Sword Brothers had already built, and then pushing south against Lithuania. Riga remained their most important base of operations, but in 1250 they built a new castle at Filin, now Viljandi, in Estonia, which would become their second biggest centre. Numerous smaller castles were also built over the next 30 years. In the mid-1240s, the Order re-established control over Courland and its bishopric, and a new convent was built at Goldingen, now Kuldiga, in Latvia. The region rebelled and was suppressed by the Order again in 1253, and its territory was divided between the Order and the Church. In the 1240s, the Semigalians had allied themselves with the Order against Samogitia and converted to Catholicism. When Mindaugas made his own conversion to Catholicism in 1251, The order demanded land as part of the settlement between them, and Mindaugas gave them land in Samagitia. On this land, the order built a castle at Memel, now Klaipėda in Lithuania, which quickly grew into a town that served as a midway point, joining the order's territory in Prussia and Livonia. When the peace broke down in the mid-1250s, the Samogitians attacked Memel. The attack ended with a new truce backed by the merchants of Riga, but by the end of the decade, Samogitian raids had returned. The Battle of Skoden saw a major defeat of the order by the Samogitians, with 33 knights killed. In response, the order imposed an emergency military tax on the Semigallians, 7 times the usual amount. The Semigallians could not or would not pay, and to prevent rebellion, the knights were forced to build new castles and carry out punitive campaigns against the local population. These repressive actions drove the Semigallians into an alliance with the Samogitians, soon joined by the Curonians. Their attempts to take the order's castles failed, but in July 1260 it came to open battle, and the order suffered a catastrophic defeat. The Master of Livonia, Burchard of Hornhausen, and the Prussian Marshal were killed. The victory triggered new uprisings among the Osselians, Curonians, Semigallians, and Prussians. In Samagitia, Mindaugas turned against the Christians, expelling missionaries and destroying the cathedral that had been under construction. The conflict in southern Livonia continued for the next 7 years. In the winter of late 1269, the Lithuanians invaded Livonia, crossing the frozen sea to the island of Orsil, now Estonian Saaremaa. The order's new master, Otto of Lutterberg, led a combined German and Danish army onto the ice to meet them. The Battle of Karuza was another disaster for the order, with the master and many of the knights slain. However, the new master, Walter of Norbeck, called in reinforcements from Prussia and managed to push the Lithuanians back and take several of their fortresses. The Semigallians were forced to accept a truce, and the construction of a new castle was ordered at Dunaburg, now Daugavpils, in Latvia. The new castle became the base for future attacks on Lithuania, and forced Lithuania to change the focus of its attacks, allowing the order to consolidate its hold on their territory. In 1279, the Semigallians joined the Lithuanians and captured Tervietin. They managed to hold it for 2 years, before the order brought up a large army, forcing the Semigallians to agree to another truce, which allowed them to keep Tervietin if they agreed to pay taxes. The order continued building taxes to try to secure its position across the region. In late 1285, it began work on Heiligenberg, now Svietgalns in Latvia, across the river from Tervietin. The works triggered Samogitian and Semigallian attacks, but they were unable to stop the castle being completed. Soon the Semigallians were forced to abandon Tervietin. In 1290, the last district of Semigallia still fighting, Sidrabene, surrendered, officially ending hostilities. As in Prussia, the region was desolated by forced population transfers and flight into Lithuania. Settlement in southern Semigallia completely collapsed, and the region was not repopulated for nearly 2 centuries. For southern Courland, the chronicles are less clear, but the disappearance of native place names suggests that a similar depopulation took place. 120 years from the first papal bull authorizing the Northern Crusades, the Order had finally conquered and pacified the territories that it had targeted. In modern terms, the Baltic population had suffered genocide, killed, forcibly relocated, and assimilated or driven away. The southern Baltic coast had become German. The Order's control was still not total. As I have mentioned a few times, the Order and the Church authorities, particularly the Archbishop of Riga, were frequently at odds, and this conflict had dragged on for several decades. It had begun with the appointment of Riga's first Archbishop, Albert Suerbeer, back in 1251. The position gave him episcopal jurisdiction over Prussia and Livonia, and he managed to have differing opinions from the Order on a wide range of matters, most importantly, who was ultimately in charge. Albert's patron was a German nobleman, Gunselin of Schwerin, who was also a staunch advocate of keeping the Order in their place. However, when Gunselin returned to his homeland to recruit troops to support the Archbishop, the Order seized the opportunity to arrest and imprison Albert. Gunselin was warned not to return to Livonia, and the Archbishop was forced to recognize the Order's authority. In 1274, the Order persuaded the Holy Roman Emperor to ratify its rule over Riga, which broke the conflict back out into the open. The Archbishop of Riga continued to demand the Order swear allegiance as his vassals, and the conflict will continue for the next 50 years. Decades after it arrived in the north, the Teutonic Order had finally established its rule over the southern Baltic coast, although Prussia and Livonia remained separated by the northwestern triangle of Lithuania protruding between them. The new Catholic polities of Prussia and Livonia had been created, with much of the native population exterminated, forcibly relocated, assimilated, or driven away from their land. Swathes of territory were left desolate for decades, sometimes centuries, and elsewhere German settlers replaced the original population. The bishops still shared in governance of the new entities, and at the northern end, Denmark still held northern Estonia. In 1291, back in the Holy Land, Acre fell to the Mamluks, effectively marking the end of the Jerusalem Crusades. The Baltic now became the Teutonic Order's sole focus. In 1309, the Grand Master of the Order moved his residence from Venice to western Prussia, then to Marienburg, now Malbork, in Poland. Later, it would move to Königsberg. The Order maintained estates and investments throughout the Holy Roman Empire. They were used to support hospitals and churches, fulfilling the Order's pastoral role. But more importantly, they generated rents used to support its campaigns against Samogitia, Lithuania, and Poland, and its estates were a source of recruits. The Order maintained close ties with the German nobility and played a role in politics, ensuring that it retained support for its activities. A general procurator was appointed to the papal court as an intermediary between the Grand Master and the Pope, who worked to ensure official support against the Order's enemies. The new entities did not function quite like normal states. They have been called monastic states, theocracies, or crusader states. In German, they were called the Ordensstaat, the Order's state. Historians often use Ordensland, the Order's land. The Order itself used Terra Mariana, the land of the Virgin Mary, and Mary was the symbolic sovereign of both Prussia and Livonia. The Grand Master joined the Hanseatic League, and the Order used its forces to combat piracy in the eastern Baltic. He often led negotiations between the League and other European rulers. Marienburg became a major European court, and the Prussian and Livonian masters also became increasingly important. Despite all this, the Knights remained a religious order that enforced a monastic code of conduct, celibacy, and the renunciation of personal property. As you would expect, the Order's legitimacy was based on its rights as conqueror. This was recognized by both the conquered native population and the new settlers arriving. The Order decided who held land and who had privileges. It provided justice, collected taxes, and minted coins, bearing the mark of the Grand Master in Prussia and the Provincial Master in Livonia. Much of the population lived within sight of their castles and fortified convents, a constant reminder, the source of their power. The Order created a hierarchical system of governance, with each province divided into commanderies. Each commandery was based around a convent, each of which nominally had 12 knight brothers, representing the 12 apostles, although the actual number of knights present would vary widely depending on the needs of the day. For the entire duration of the Order's rule of the Baltic, there were no local knights. Knights were mostly recruited through the Order's German estates, especially from Westphalia, the Rhineland, and southwest Germany. The recruits were mostly minor nobility. Each convent was headed by a commander appointed for 1 year, and they were rotated across commanderies, giving each commander broad experience and enhancing their overall unity. The commander was supported by a Hauskomtur, or house commander, who looked after the day-to-day running of the convent. In addition to the knights, there would be at least one priest and lay clerics who were responsible for the convent's religious life. There was a force of soldiers, managed by a brother sergeant, who wore a grey habit with a black cross. The convent would also have the necessary servants and administrators to support these functions of the order. Over time, these commanderies increasingly took on economic roles, which meant additional staff to manage stores, granaries, stables, smithies, and so on, as each adapted to the specific needs it encountered in its area. By 1300, Livonia was divided into 22 commanderies, and Prussia into 31. New commanderies would be created as the order acquired further territories during the 14th century. As the region developed and populations grew, the commanderies were subdivided into districts managed by advocates, procurators, or bailiffs. These officials acted as judges and tax collectors and managed trade and military provisioning. Over time, some districts grew in importance to the extent that their advocates or procurators became independent officials reporting directly to the Grand Master. As the head of a hierarchical order rather than a monarch, the Grand Master was an unusual ruler. The order made its decisions through assemblies of the brothers, called chapters. The Grand Master and those entitled to elect him, the Grand Commander, Grand Marshal, Grand Hospitaller, Grand Quartermaster, and the Treasurer, formed the most important chapter. Previously, this chapter had been based in Acre and Venice, but they were now spread across the Baltic. The provincial chapters of the Master and Commanders met annually to decide major policy, and in theory there was a general chapter of all the order's members, but it met only infrequently, and when it did there were always those who were unable to attend. Once the Grand Master had moved to Marienburg, the Master of Prussia became a Marshal. Livonia and the Order's territories in the Empire remained under the control of masters. Over the 14th and 15th century, the Order lost most of its Mediterranean holdings, increasing its focus on Imperial and Baltic German territories. The German Master became an Imperial Prince. The Grand Master was elected for life, although some resigned and a few were dismissed. Within its conquered territory, the Order granted fiefs and land to native vassals and German migrants, in exchange for taxes and military service. Land parcels tended to be small in order to maintain the Order's administrative control. In Livonia, the migrant population was essentially urban. Other than Riga, created as a port, cities were established next to castles under the Riga law, which was based on the Lubeck law we discussed back in the episode on the Hanseatic League. This led to the development of a situation where the countryside retained an intact native population, but the cities were German. In Prussia, there was a mass German peasant migration from the 1280s to the late 15th century. Most of the migrants came from Lower Saxony, North Rhine-Westphalia, Central Germany, and Holland. The eastern borderlands had a mixed German, Polish, Lithuanian population, while the rest of Prussia became German. Prussia used the Kulm law, which was based on the Magdeburg law, for the 96 German towns and cities established there, 72 of which were directly ruled by the Order. The Kulm law was somewhat less liberal and democratic than the Riga law. In addition to owning the land, this law provided that the Order owned the lakes and rivers, and therefore it also granted fishing rights. If people went hunting, the right shoulder of any kill was paid to the Order. There was very limited native migration into the German cities. Almost complete cultural segregation was enforced until the end of the 14th century, and remained common in practice for centuries after that. By this point, the remnant Prussian population was less than 100,000 people, mainly in the east. By the end of the 15th century, linguistic evidence of Old Prussian has ceased. They were assimilated, and the Prussian language and culture was gone. There was not complete linguistic and cultural uniformity. The annexation of Pomerelia in the mid-14th century brought a large number of Poles and Kashubians into Prussia, who gradually came to be accepted as Prussians, even if they did not speak German. The Order's wealth was built on the same foundations that had been driving the Baltic economy throughout our story: the trade from the Eastern European hinterland through the Baltic Sea to the rest of Europe. The order imposed a monopoly on the amber trade, and for the rest taxed agricultural production, salt and river and port traffic, inheritances, as well as selling offices and licenses for hunting and fishing. As with rulers elsewhere in the Middle Ages, the order dedicated a large part of its revenue to public works, which in the Baltic context meant castles and fortified convents. Castles that will soon be put to work in conflict with the rising power of Lithuania. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.